Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed a restful break over lunch. We have a fantastic afternoon planned for you, kicking off with our next panel. To introduce our speakers, it is my great pleasure to introduce the Honourable Sarah Mitchell MLC. Sarah is a member of the Nationals and the Deputy Leader of the Opposition in the Legislative Council, Shadow Minister for Education and Early Learning, and Shadow Minister for Western New South Wales. In the previous government, Sarah served as Minister for Education and Early Learning and Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. Sarah is now and has, throughout her parliamentary career, been a very active member of our committee system, where she served alongside Dr. Phelps, and I imagine has some pretty colourful stories and memories from that time. Please join me in welcoming the Honourable Sarah Mitchell to the stage.
Thank you. Thanks, Janelle. Don't worry, Dr. Phelps, I'll save those stories for when we're offline. They'll be more interesting then. Thank you for the very kind introduction, Janelle, and welcome everybody. I hope you've had a great morning. It sounds like it's been going very well, and we've got an exciting afternoon planned for you too. It's my pleasure to introduce the next session, which will examine the evolution of electoral systems in New South Wales and the rise of the crossbench. In the last half century, the New South Wales Upper House has become a popularly elected body based on proportional representation. And as a result, the Legislative Council has had to evolve to adapt to its changing membership and functions. One way that the Council's membership has evolved is through the prominent growth of minor parties and independent members. This rise has been accompanied by a shift in the traditional assumptions surrounding the role of the Parliament. To explore this shift in greater detail, allow me to introduce Antony Green AO and Dr. Peter Phelps. Antony, I'll start with you. As you would all know, Antony has worked for the ABC since 1989 as an election analyst. He has worked on every federal, state and territory election over the last 35 years, which is around 90 in total, which is amazing. In our house, I don't think it's election night unless Antony's on the screen, and when he calls it, you know that that's the result. Doesn't matter what the Electoral Commission website say. So there's no better introduction than that. In addition to working on Australian elections, he's also covered elections in the UK, New Zealand, Canada and the USA. Antony was involved in designing the ABC's election night results computer and election website. He has also designed interactive tools to model election results, as well as a Senate election calculator that has revolutionised coverage of Senate elections. For 3 decades, Antony has also produced publications for several state parliamentary libraries. In 2006, he researched a substantial website for the New South Wales Parliament, documenting the state's electoral and political history. He also writes a popular blog on electoral matters. Antony has contributed to the public debate on politics through submissions to parliamentary inquiries, attending political science conferences and making speeches at political forums. Please join me in welcoming Antony Green. Now to Dr. Phelps. Dr. Peter Phelps is a former member of the New South Wales Legislative Council who served from 2011, we both came in together in that election, to 2019, and he was also the government whip. He holds a PhD in Australian history and has taught at the University of Sydney and Australian Catholic University. Prior to entering Parliament, Dr. Phelps served as a senior federal political staffer in the Howard government, and most recently he has worked with UNSW Canberra to develop postgraduate courses on evidence-based policy, executive government and dealing with policy creation within the environment of minority government. And if you have any spare time, I would encourage you to go back and look at the Hansard when Dr. Phelps was in the New South Wales Legislative Council. I don't think we had a wittier or quicker member on their feet, and some of it is definitely worth having a look at and having a chuckle. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Phelps. So I'll now hand over and we'll have some questions shortly, but Antony, over to you.
Now, I brought a few props, and I'm not sure, do you want to bring that one up here? This is something that when I speak on electoral systems, I always end up having to discuss at some point, which I just lean over there, I think. This is, for those not familiar with it, is the ballot paper we were all given on election day in 1999, the infamous tablecloth, which I'll come to a little later. There's a few other things to do first. Now, before, just something interesting is that you talked about 90 elections. Of course, for all that time, I've been preparing books of notes for the ABC. A lot of it appears now on the website, but I'm actually early next year depositing them all in the National Library as PDFs for people to use. So, book of notes on every state, federal and territory election since 1990 for people to peruse. And having done work on past elections and having to sort of slog through old microfilms of newspapers and wishing there were some contemporary notes to use. I'm hoping that what I'm depositing in the library will be useful that way. Now, before I was working in politics and elections, my background was in science originally, and when I was in my early 20s, I was a keen reader of essays by paleontologist and evolutionary theorist Dr. Stephen Jay Gould. Many of his essays dealt with the role of contingency in evolution. Further evolution of organisms is often limited by the inherited toolkit of characteristics passed to it. Goulden's evolutionary writings are something I always keep in mind when I'm thinking about political institutions and electoral systems. Books on electoral systems classify electoral systems by type, single member versus proportional representation, and further subdivisions being the most obvious, and outline how the different systems work against a set of principles for representation. Books on electoral systems tend to be very functional in their approach, whereas I freely admit to the academic sin of being terribly bound to historicism. And more often than not, electoral systems and their current form is explained more by their development and their history than any classification into electoral systems. There are key points in the evolution of electoral systems and institutions of parliament and the like where the toolbox can be changed, but beyond that point, evolution tends to take place within that constriction that's been put on in the first place. If you're talking about the New South Wales Legislative Council, there are three key points which determine the council is today. One was an 1850s decision to make it an appointed chamber, which determined that it didn't end up being abolished. But the two key dates after that were 1933 and 1978, the 2 years that the council was reformed. But what's interesting, and between those dates, the systems tended to develop by evolution, either by the players learning the rules of the game and taking them in ways people hadn't expected when they designed the system, or simply by the need to change for other reasons, which causes change in the system. Sometimes that evolution, I'll also start my talk by stating perhaps the controversial view that state legislative councils are something you inherit rather than invent. State legislative councils exist because bicameralism was adopted by the Australian colonies in the 1850s. Once created, legislative councils proved difficult to abolish, and instead over many decades they evolved into democratic forms. Significant that the three parliaments since created by the Commonwealth, which is the ACT, the Northern Territory and Papua New Guinea, none of them were given upper houses, which tells you something about why they were adopted then and why they're not adopted now. My comment on inheritance does not apply to the Commonwealth Senate. State experiences with bicameralism was a guide to the Senate's form, especially in the adoption of the same franchise as the lower house, which was a radical step considering at the time none of the legislative councils were popularly elected. The Liberals who were at the conventions insisted that if the upper house was going to be appointed, was going to be elected, it should have the same franchise as the lower house. It should not have the restricted franchises that applied in many states at the time. And that was also why, as was discussed earlier this morning, why the first drafts of the Constitution were amended to make popular election by the end of the process. But there's a key provision in the Australian Constitution that quite specifically states that when the Commonwealth adopted a franchise, it would be the same for both houses. And that did not apply in any of the states until for a very long time, varied from state to state. The other point about why inheritance doesn't apply to the Senate, it was a clearly designed institution. Bicameralism in federal parliaments, in federal nations, is actually relatively common. That if you've got a nation which is subdivided into regions, those regions have some form of different representation in the upper house of parliament, and most federations have something of that form. Creating state versions of the House of Commons in the 1850s was fairly obvious, though it was implemented more radically than the colonial office expected. The influence in early 19th century chartists in Britain had a huge influence on development in Australian democracy, with the early adoption of manhood suffrage, the secret ballot, which of course came in here in the 1850s, decades before Britain, manhood suffrage, which was many decades before Britain, which was after the First World War. Payment of members came slightly later, the votes for women, the abolition of plural voting, all these things came in the 19th century. It's often one of the sad things about Australian political history is that not enough attention is paid to the experiments from pre-Federation days. Most of the institutions, electoral institutions Australia developed and have been exported to the world were from the colonial period. The two big changes in Federation times, which is compulsory voting and preferential voting, have not spread. So people who sort of discount the experimentation of the colonies sort of ignore the record of what happened since. But of course, when they came to create the legislative councils in the 1850s, and this has been dealt with earlier, the example of the Bunyip aristocracy and why that was rejected, and what emerged were appointed legislative councils in New South Wales and Queensland, and legislative councils with a restricted franchise in the other colonies. These acted as bulwarks against an excess of democracy in the lower house. They were there to represent established interests, which at the time usually meant landed interests. And to paraphrase Edmund Burke, they were acting as a bond between the dead, the living, and the yet to be born. I'm being provocative about that because actually the Legislative Council, in fact, didn't act as a bulwark against land reform in the 1850s in New South Wales. And as I think was discussed this morning, there was an argument about stacking the Legislative Council when it wouldn't support reform. And the 1850s, when you look back at it, what they did with land laws in 1859 and 1860 is you would blanch if you tried something that radical today. As many have noted, the appointed legislative councils proved easier to reform or abolish. The Queensland Legislative Council was abolished in 1922, and the New South Wales body just avoided the same fate later that decade. That abolition attempt and the more radical actions of the Lang government between 1930 and 1932 led to the entrenchment and radical reform of the way the Legislative Council was appointed. Yet in the other states, Legislative Council with restricted franchises were always able to claim some form of electoral mandate to their existence and provide greater protection against reform. The fear of claiming a popular mandate that is today is again raised these days when you hear any discussion about reform of the House of Lords. The fear of having an upper chamber the upper chamber in Britain has become rather assertive on its rights in recent years, even doing things which in this country become normal, which is demanding papers and demanding documents. Even doing that is considered radical in Britain, let alone having a mandate from popular election. So the debate that's gone on with legislative councils in Australia, it's interesting to see them repeated in Britain more recently. But let me come back to New South Wales. As I said, there were two key points in New South Wales electoral history when the Legislative Council was reformed, and they have determined how our Legislative Council has developed since. Now, what I'd like to argue is the reform in 1933, and just to explain this, what happened was that to reform the Legislative Council, they introduced a form of indirect election. It was a proposal of something called the Bryce Committee of the House of Lords on House of Lords reform during the First World War, and it recommended a form of indirect election where the Parliament itself acted as the electorate to indirectly elect members. It would mean that the Council couldn't claim a mandate, but it would ensure that it was reflective of the rest of the Parliament, and along with staggered terms would make it the sort of chamber that would only change slowly. It would be able to reject the sort of radical steps that the Lang government was trying to do in its term in office. But what I'd argue is that the 1933 changes, in fact, isolated New South Wales from the debate that was going on in other states. During that time, there were disputes between upper and lower houses in Victoria, in Western Australia, South Australia and Tasmania, arguments over rights to block budget bills, rights to block other bills, whether there should be some sort of conference of managers, whether there should be resolution disputes a la the Commonwealth double dissolution power. There was also disputes which were essentially about trying to make the Legislative Council more representative. And there are several points I'd just like to point here, because these debates didn't happen in New South Wales. In New South Wales, these debates came up with the introduction of popular election in 1978. These were broadening the franchise, conjoint elections, holding council and assembly elections at the same time, removing malapportionments and gerrymanders for upper house, which was, those things have a long history in Australia, but they were generally worse in upper houses. Whether there should be a proportional representation and whether there should be an end to staggered terms. In Victoria, adult franchise, compulsory voting and preferential voting were extended to the councils in the 1950s. Western Australia introduced full adult franchise in 1963, Tasmania in 1968, and South Australia in 1975. It seems remarkable today to think that 50 years ago they were still having an argument about whether upper houses should have full franchise. Conjoint elections were a mechanism to tie upper house elections to the party forms of the lower house. If you hold an upper house election at the same time as the lower house, then the structure of the election debate is over the party contest for the lower house. That's why after several separate half-Senate elections in the 1960s, no parliament since 1974 has dared to hold a separate House half-Senate election. Is that other issues intrude on the campaign in a way which governments find very unattractive. So one of the ways of getting rid of the independence in upper houses, some of these upper houses have had a long history of independence, was to make sure that their elections are held at the same time. Now, conjoint elections were introduced in Victoria in 1962, South Australia in 1975, and Tasmania continues as the only state with a separate date for council elections. They hold 2 or 3 legislative council elections every year, 3 individual electorates in different parts of the state, with strict rules on expenditure, strict rules that prevent parties spending money if they campaign for them, and held at a different time. And it's the only council in the country which continues to be dominated by independents rather than political parties, though political parties have been making inroads into the council in recent years. Western Australia modified its system in the early 60s from 6-year terms with 3-member divisions, with 1 member elected every 2 years, which meant every term of parliament there would always be a separate legislative council election at some point. That, along with broadening the franchise, was introduced together in the early 60s, though technically the Legislative Council is the only chamber on the mainland which is not tied to the term of the lower house. They technically still have a separate date, but for a variety of reasons they always hold them at the same time. In the same way, the House and the Senate have separate terms, but they always hold the elections on the same day. Malapportionment in legislative councils was generally much larger in lower houses and took longer to disappear. The Tasmanians finally got rid of it in the 1990s, but not before a rather strange debate which came very close to seeing the whole legislative council elected at once, until it was revealed that on legal advice that if the legislative council had to be elected all at once, the constitution would cease to exist. Tasmania doesn't actually have a real constitution. It's like a subset of a British Act. But anyway, that's Tasmania. There's always something odd happening there. But in March next year, the last of the malapportioned upper houses is abolished when Western Australia abolishes its 6 regions and moves to a statewide election, which will be a very interesting experiment when it comes to it next year, and I'll mention it why later. So how did New South Wales go with its indirect election? So as I said, all those debates on those other issues didn't arrive in New South Wales till 1978. The first election with indirect election occurred in 1933. There'd been a referendum to reform the council to be 60 members elected for 12 years, with 1/4 elected every 3 years, with separate terms to the lower house and members elected at an indirect election. For much of that period, there were 90 members of the lower house and 60 members of the upper house, so there were 150 members to vote at this election by proportional representation to elect the upper house. So if you work that out, there were 15 positions, 150 members, a quota is 1/16, so it was about 9.1 votes to get elected into the upper house. And because there were so few votes, what they did was, when the votes were counted, they would multiply them all by 1,000, so they had every vote was 1 vote became 1,000 votes, and then they could do fractional distribution of preferences. And the reports of the distributions of preferences are very odd, I will tell you. One day I'll publish them for everybody. It's very strange. Now, the election was under PRS TV, as I said. Now, very similar to New South Wales used in the 1920s and what Tasmania used prior to the war. New South Wales did actually use proportional representation from 3 elections from 1920 to 1925. The ballot paper in those days, with the names are just listed in alphabetical order, no party names. There was no grouping. The first election was full preferential voting, and they got 10% informal votes that probably went to optional at the next election. Tasmania used a very similar system, but until the Commonwealth came along in 1949 with the Senate, it was a rather unknown system. Over the first election was held in 1933. There were 126 candidates nominated. You had to be a member of one of the two. You didn't have to be a member. You had to be nominated and seconded by somebody who was a member of the House. At the time, the Legislative Council, with stacking, had reached something like 130 members. The lower house had 90. There were 126 nominations from various numbers in both sides of the House. Members could only nominate or second a single member. So there's always a bit of a lot of strange rules about this. So they held 4 elections over a fortnight apart. The first election had 126 candidates for 12-year terms, electing 15. And the remaining 111 went in a fortnight later for the next 9-year terms, and so on until you got to the 3-year terms at the 4th election. And the new council took its position early in 1934. Over the next 5 elections between 1936 and 1949, the number of candidates varied between 25 and 33. But from that point on, there was a sudden change. So for 15 vacancies at the 9 elections between 1951 and 1976, the number of candidates varied for 15 vacancies between 16 and 18. So both parties' nominates suddenly cut back the number of candidates. Now, I'll explain why. We're probably all used to the Senate system. Someone has 2.7 quotas, that's 2 quotas with 0.7 left over, and it flows on in preferences, etc. And if you've got a contest between a party with 2.7 quotas and a single candidate with 0.8 of a quota, you'd get 2 from the first ticket, and 0.8 beats 0.7 for the last seat. Now, that's how we work in the Senate, and over the years, Tasmania's moved to this system. We have rules that candidates appear in groups, and we have rules on minimum number of preferences. So between party preferences isn't a problem in the Australian system. If you go to Ireland, who uses a very different system, but lists everyone in alphabetical order, parties only stand as many seats and candidates as they can elect members, because the most efficient way to run the Senate-style system is to split your vote across the candidates. So if you have 2.7 quotas of votes, what if you can split those votes so each of your 3 candidates has 0.9? Then your 3 candidates at 0.9 would beat the candidate on 0.8, and you'd end up with 3 and they'd end up with none. That's what happened in the Legislative Council, is over those years. So in 1951, Legislative Council election for 150 members voting to elect 15 members of the upper house. The 15 retiring members got to vote. It's actually quite fascinating. The election was held before their seats became vacant. One candidate polled 11 votes. Another 9 polled 10. There were 2 with 9, 3 with 7, 1 with 6, and 1 with 4. Now, what was going on here? Well, one reason was this ordering of the splitting up the vote to ensure that it was maximised. And the point was, if a party could put all its votes into a single candidate, it maximised the number of members elected. And these parties were competing for maybe only 1 or 2 seats. You knew how many 150 members there were, and you were pretty confident was their party representation. If you could arrange to split the votes, you'd do it that way. And that is extraordinary reports, because if you've got 9 candidates with 10 votes, and they've all got a surplus, which one do you exclude first? And what they did would take all the ballot papers and they'd count them all. Where's their second preference? Where's their third preference? Where's their fourth preference? Where's their fifth preference? And amazingly, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they all have the same number of votes at every preference. This is amazing. How did this happen? Well, what happened was the parties learned to manipulate the system. And in 1949 at the Legislative Council election, let me find my bit of paper here with the explanation. I think it's one of these. Here we are. 4 people for the Labor Party members didn't vote the right way, and an independent got up. The Labor Party expelled those 4 members ahead of the 1950 election, and I mentioned their names. Jack Geraghty, I think it is, Stanley, the member for Lakemba, Jack Seifert, the member for Monaro, and S.R. Heffron, the member for Barwon. They all lost their seats. No, sorry, 2 of them lost their seats. But Seifert was re-elected, but Labor couldn't find a candidate to run against him, so they re-emitted him. But Geraghty in North Shore won his seat. And just a little side light, Geraghty was campaigning. One of the things he campaigned was about the liquor interests and he wanted registered clubs to have licenses, and he wanted to have poker machines. And a Royal Commission came out of that, and one of the consequences of excluding those 4 members and that hung parliament produced in 1950 was poker machines in clubs. Just a little sidelight there, but that's nothing to do with Legislative Council. But what happened the next election, in early 1950, the Labor Party had been in office. It had got control of the council late in the 1940s. So it's saying these are staggered terms. Every time there was a by-election, if you had the majority of all the numbers, you could grab a seat off the other side. If it was a Liberal member died and a Labor had the majority of the seats, you could grab that seat. So that's one of the reasons the numbers changed. The second is when one of these elections came round, the increasing Labor representation in the lower house in the 1940s gave Labor the advantage to get more than half of the seats at the proportional representation election. So Labor had got control of it slowly. But after that 1949 election, when there was a vacancy the next year and they were dead keen to win the seat, the Labor Party nominated, let me see my number, they nominated 8 candidates against the Liberal. Why did they do that? Just think about this. This is a mathematical thing. If you've got 5 candidates contesting an election, you just think about numbers. There are 5 options for your first preference. Having given a first preference, there are 4 options for a second, 3 for the third, and 2 for the fourth. So there's 5 by 4 is 20, by 3 is 60, by 2 is 120. If you've done 5 candidates, there's 120 different versions of a how to vote card you can distribute. And every member was given a how to vote card to follow. Now, when they held the election for the upper house, all the members went into the Legislative Council chamber, little private booths. It was a secret ballot. But when they counted the votes, someone would be sitting there tallying every ballot paper they saw. Did they follow the how to vote card? So after 1949, the Labor Party did that. At this by-election, they nominated all these different candidates to make sure that they won that seat, that nobody ratted on the ticket. And then at the next subsequent elections, one of the reasons for cutting the numbers and then producing these strange results where everybody got the same number of votes was they did that, 1, to check the how to votes, and 2, to determine the order of exclusion. This was all a game to try and get that extra seat at the end. Now, generally, the coalition didn't respond to this. But after the attempt at upper house reform in 1961, the bunch of members went to the independent Labor bench and it became a bit more complex. What happened at that point is it became much more complex when a vacancy came up. And there was a famous by-election in 1965, just after Askin came to power. Another way to get someone across the floor, there was an independent Labor, Cyril Carl, I think his name was, and the Labor Party nominated his brother on their ticket. And they got 1 extra vote somewhere in that vote. That tied the vote, and then Labor won the seat in a draw from a hat. And the Askin government was so furious when there was another by-election 4 weeks later. Labor nominated 5 candidates and the Liberal Party nominated 5 candidates. 1 vacancy, 10 candidates, 5 from each for the same reason. So the tactic was copied. Now, over the years, the Legislative Council became completely irrelevant to an extent like that. You'd get situations where they wanted to appoint Neville Wran leader in the lower house, but that would create a vacancy in the upper house. So they appointed a Liberal to a judgeship. So there were 2 positions and they both got 1 if they held the election by proportional representation. So there were fewer and fewer elections. And then along came 1978. And I'll just run through. So what happened in 1978, the Wran government came to office. It first proposed just to backtrack, in other states, learning from other states. The Commonwealth had introduced preferential voting in the lower house in 1919, created a problem for the Senate. They needed to number the Senate ballot paper. In 1924, they introduced tickets. They weren't the same way we have them now, but they were down on the ballot paper. Candidates were lifted in alphabetical order. Groups were allocated in a complex formula which looked at the letters of all the candidates on the ballot paper and they allocated a column. In 1937, the Labor Party nominated 4 candidates for the Senate whose names all began with the letter A. So they got the first column on the ballot paper. So they introduced a new formula for that, and in 1940 they completely restructured the ballot papers and put them in columns and had a random ballot for draw columns, and also allowed the parties to determine the order of the candidates. Didn't seem relevant, that last point, until 1949 when they introduced proportional representation and parties were then able to determine the order their candidates were elected. After that, the next state to move to proportional representation was South Australia after an enormous battle. The first attempt was with a form of list PR, not the preferential voting we're used to using. And as with New South Wales, they broadened the franchise, statewide electorate. This system was a proportional system with only one preference. So I won't go too much into detail here, but that was the first state experience of proportional representation. New South Wales never ran first proposed the South Australian system. The coalition had kittens, they didn't like it, and they wanted the Senate system. So the Wren government altered, moved to that, did a couple of compromises, which resulted in the coalition giving away control of the Legislative Council at the first election by agreeing how many continuing members went on. But what they did do, the Wren government, and both South Australia was also concerned about this, the giant ballot paper in the 1974 Senate election and the high informal vote at Senate elections, they wanted to ensure that the informal vote was lower. So New South Wales went for optional preferential voting, had strong provisions for errors to save votes, but they made the fatal error of adopting the entire Senate counting system of the day and sticking in Schedule 6 of the Constitution, including, as Peter will know, random sampling to determine distribution of preferences. So New South Wales, despite moving to a computerised counting, must use computers to improve the accuracy of the random sampling. I won't go too much into it here, but it's a good example of you don't put too much detail in the Constitution. So the quota was 6.25%. 4-year terms were added in 1981, which made the council was going to be three-year terms. Adopting 4-year terms took the term out to 12 years. This was viewed as unacceptable. Now, what happened after that? The Senate was then changed in 1984 with the introduction of above-the-line voting and introduction of group ticket votes. South Australia moved to group ticket votes and the Senate-style system in 85. New South Wales adopted group ticket votes in 1988, but if a party lodged a split ticket, it would have to have 2 boxes above the line. But as there were no party names on the ballot paper, because New South Wales didn't adopt that, what were these 2 boxes there for? So no one tried that. And in 1991, there was a referendum held in New South Wales. No one mentioned the actual wording of the referendum. Ted Pickering was always proud of this. Do you approve of a bill entitled "A Bill for an Act to Reduce the Number of Politicians in the Legislative Council and to Reduce their Maximum Terms in Office"? It was, Ted reckons that was the cleverest wording of a referendum ever. It passed. So we went to 2 21 rotations. Now, I'll just have to quickly go through the rest of this because I've been talking too long. But what's happened since is the other states have followed the same form. WA adopted PR, but with regions and group ticket votes in 1989, but abandoned rotations. The New South Wales, 1995 in New South Wales, we had the election of Alan Corbett from A Better Future for Our Children from 1.3% because of group ticket votes. It wasn't a rort, just everyone thought Alan was a really nice man and gave him preferences. And he spent so little on his campaign, he couldn't claim all his public funding. We had the famous tablecloth, which is that one, in 1999 when the failure to amend the party registration rules and group ticket voting produced a lottery for the final seat. New South Wales then moved to abolish group voting tickets. That's been since copied federally, copied in West Australia, but still remains in Victoria, though they're moving to abandon it. South Australia, since abolished group ticket votes, everyone's moved to the new Senate system, which was first introduced in New South Wales. But where does that new, as I said, Western Australia in the new year moves to the Senate-style system, abolishing group voting tickets, but with 37 candidates. It'll be interesting to see how that works. I think it might be a complete disaster. The ballot paper could be that size, and how the hell they count it, I don't know. You can't get scanners that big. But where is it left us? Well, one of the arguments is group voting tickets. Now, I've brought my ballot papers, I have to show them. That's the Senate ballot paper from 2013, where the Senate couldn't do that, couldn't put them on rows, so they had to shrink the font size. That was the one where Liberal Democrats won in column A, because the columns were so narrow, it was put over two rows. And so people could read that ballot paper. They issued these magnifying sheets, if anyone remembers that. And where does New South Wales end up with? Well, it's ended up with this, which I like to call the mutant lotto form. It has, for an upper house ballot paper, has twice the informal voting rate of every other state. Because what do you do with that? It's, I think we should look at the instructions, but we are tied because of the way the constitutional details are entrenched to a group, if it runs and wants a box above the square, must stand 15 candidates. If you ask me, where does the New South Wales Legislative Council go, and can it learn and evolve from experiments interstate? To me, one, it would be to rewrite Schedule Schedule 6 to remove some of the ridiculous detail that's there. The other would be, do we want to keep staggered terms for the Legislative Council? Are we happy to have a very low quota and a very large crossbench? To some extent, that comes down to the issue which has never been dealt with Legislative Councils is, all right, we democratise them, but what are their powers supposed to be? Should it have the power to block all legislation, or should it only have delaying powers? And one of the arguments, I think, in favour of that might occur if you move to a fully proportional system is it might raise the issue more about at what point does the Legislative Council continue to have power and at what point it become a delaying and reviewing body. Because Council's main roles that it does is actually committees, and the Councils have forced committees and estimates committees on governments around the country. So the Legislative Council has a lot of powers. I would say, does it still need the powers to destroy a government? Or can its powers be altered? I suspect you raised the spectre in 1975, so that's not going to happen. I suspect the New South Wales Legislative Council is a bit stuck with its system until some sort of compromise can be made about fixing Schedule 6 in particular, so that they can use computers to count the result accurately rather than get the random sample correct. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I agree entirely we're on a unity ticket there. As a former chair of the JSCEM, we tried to get that changed, but it requires a constitutional referendum, and no government wants to have one of those. Today, I'm talking about the rise of the crossbench, the reasons and responses. And before I start, I'd like to thank Ben, President Ben, David, Janelle, for putting this conference on. Thank you for all coming along to it. I also like to thank someone who isn't here, Matthew Mason Cox, who was one of the early progenitors of an idea for a bicentennial conference. The crossbench. Political scientists tend to focus on premiers and the executive and don't tend to talk much about minority government. Public administration theorists treat politics as something that ruins good policy making, and they don't generally look to the role of individual parliamentarians. As Professor Robert Rhodes has noted on many occasions, policy scholars treat the parliament as though it's marginal. Today I want to talk about crossbenches in parliament, particularly their current electoral popularity. Why did it occur? What does it mean? What does executive government do about it? And what the consequences are for what I believe to be entrenched minority government in Australian parliaments in the future. Firstly, however, I should explain what I mean by the crossbench. They are the independent or minor party MPs who do not make up the government or the official opposition benches. They're called the crossbench because of where they sit in the parliamentary chamber and not because they're cross all the time, which they are anyway. So they sit in between the benches. In New South Wales, particularly in the Legislative Council, but also in the Legislative Assembly, there's been a massive rise in the crossbench. Growth over the past 50 years has been notable and dramatic. The actual numbers for upper and lower houses can be seen there, red for the upper house and green for the lower house. And I've also added trend lines, and noticeably there's a rate of growth higher in the council, but interestingly, both are going up. In the council in particular, because you only need 4.5% of the vote roughly to get a quota to get you into the upper house, and in many instances towards the bottom end of the tail, position 21, 20, 19, even 18, you can get up on a sub-quota amount. That's led to some in the major parties saying, well, we should amend the system so that you have to get a quota before you can become a member of parliament. Unsurprisingly, that hasn't gone very far because of the reaction which would be engendered by that. So who are these crossbenchers? Well, there's defectors from existing parties, so a person's elected as a Labor or Liberal or One Nation member of parliament, and then decide they're jack of the party, flip the table and go and sit as independents. They are not elected as independents in the upper house in New South Wales. Upper house in New South Wales has always been party structure. You get independent crossbenchers in the lower house only being elected as independent crossbenchers. You get minor party crossbenchers in both houses, but more particularly in the upper house. And in that period of time, since 1981, we've had the Christian Democrats, the Australian Democrats, the Greens, the Shooters, who became the Shooters and Fishers, who then became the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers, A Better Future for Our Children, One Nation, Legal System Reform, Unity, Outdoor Recreation, Animal Justice, Legalised Cannabis, and the Liberal Democrats. That's a fairly diverse cohort. So the question is, why after this period of basically bi-party stability, are they on the rise? And there's three answers normally given. The first, and I believe the weakest, is mistaken identity, where parties have two similar voting names. A person who goes into a ballot box is generally disinterested in the election process. The upper house ballot paper is large and unwieldy, complicated. So the voter allocates their first preference to the first party which they see with an iconic word in their name. So voting for the Liberal Democrats when they thought they were voting for the Liberal Party, voting for the DLP when they thought they were voting for the Australian Labor Party. I think that's a really weak argument. Secondly, distrust of major political parties is an often cited reason. Who can forget the well-worn mantra continually espoused by Don Chipp and the Australian Democrats of the need for a group of MPs who will, quote, keep the bastards honest. These non-politician politicians promise to serve as a counterweight to the dominance of the major parties, so that no government has a majority in the upper house but must negotiate legislation with so-called honest brokers. The argument goes that Australian voters don't want government to be all-powerful, which, given party discipline in Australia, they generally are if the party controls both houses. Or voters are distrustful of absolute majorities, so they split their vote between the preferred party in the lower house and a safeguard vote for another party in the upper house. I think there's some merit to that. The third, however, and I believe the most interesting reason, is that of micro-party preference. A person may wish to send a message to the major parties that their specific policy interests are not being met by the major parties, and policy-motivated voters expect the minor party to push for a specific policy irrespective of which government is in power. The most consistent example of this phenomenon is tactical voting in so-called progressive seats. Support for Labor in the lower house combined with the support for the Greens in the upper house. Again, the argument goes that voters might not want a Liberal government, but they want action on issues such as climate change or minority rights, which voters do not feel mainstream Labor addresses sufficiently well. And similarly, Conservative voters might not want a Labor government, but are unhappy with the modern Liberal Party's disdain for firearms and instead vote for SFF, or the Liberal Party's support for immigration and foreign capital movements, and hence vote for One Nation or Clive Palmer. So, why don't the major parties have policy positions which can incorporate these minority interests? Well, Harold Hotelling was a US statistician who wanted to explain the clustering phenomenon in businesses and why product convergence was preferred to product differentiation. And his quote is great. A business will move closer together to attract customers from their competitors. This results in a minimum level of product differentiation. But to explain that further, let's take a brief trip out to Bondi Beach. Okay, so we're out on Bondi Beach and two ice cream sellers decide to set up their stands. They're logical, and the people on Bondi Beach are all logical. So they set up about a third of the way in each of the way. Customers, being rational actors, don't want to walk too far to get their ice cream, so they want to walk the least distance, and so they choose the southern end of the beach, goes to the southern stand, the northern end of the beach go to the northern stand, and in the middle you have people who might not be sure which stand is closer, and so there's a bit of competition there. However, what the southern vendor noticed is if they move a little further to the north, they can capture more of a guaranteed market and have less competition in there. And similarly, the northern vendor does the same. And so what you have is Hotelling's principle in action. It's a logical and stable system. Indeed, it's the most logical and stable system until someone else with an ice cream van suddenly works out that they can capture a minority of the market if they set up on the southern end of Bondi Beach as well. And another person decides that they want to set up on the northern end of Bondi Beach as well to capture that end of the market. The decision then for the two original vendors is whether to move southward or northward to reclaim some of their market. Now, of course, those of you here will understand that I'm not talking about a beach here, but parties positioning within the political spectrum, where major parties hope to maximise voter attraction, but which offers the opportunity for minor parties to capture other areas. And in fact, this is relatively simplistic. If you actually look at the Australian political beach, and most people here would be familiar with the Australian vote compass. The y-axis is essentially the authoritarian libertarian strain. X-axis is socialism versus free market. You can see how individual parties carve out for themselves a niche on the political beach of the Australian landscape. Now, that being said, not all four of the quadrants have the same number of people, which is why Labor and Liberal position themselves in that particular area, because that's where the most are. Nevertheless, carving out a niche for yourself as the SFF or the Libertarians or Katter or the Nationals or One Nation or Labor or AJP or the Greens is statistically advantageous for you. It's rational and statistically advantageous because you gain a share of the political market which is not and cannot be serviced by the major parties, because the major parties cannot afford to lose more voters than they gain. Thus, there's no reason to believe that the current trend for minor party success will change in the future. Minor parties are here to stay, whether the big parties like it or not. But what does that mean for a parliament which in Australia has been predicated on two-party majoritarianism for the past 115 years or so? What are the consequences for Parliament and the executive of the rise of the crossbench? What does it mean for governing and lawmaking? We've all seen the standard model of Westminster-style government: executive, legislature, judiciary. Executive proposes laws, Parliament passes them, judiciary interprets them, yada, yada, yada. Basic lawmaking. But have a look at the wording in that little box underneath Parliament. Power to make and change law. Through all this discussion, there is one immutable point. Only Parliament can make and change laws. And quite simply, an idea only becomes law when the majority of politicians in the lower house and a majority of politicians in the upper house agree to it. Thus, getting the numbers is what politics is all about. And strangely, and we don't talk about this much, the actual job of MPs is to show up in this building in Parliament House and to vote for or against legislation. Now, it might surprise you the number of people who are members of Parliament who actually don't want to be here. They would much rather be in their electorates. They consider themselves, it's just a waste of time for them here in the Parliament. And that's how they literally say it's a waste of my time to be here. And as a former whip, I got to see this on an all too regular basis. I'd rather be out in the electorate, handing out giant novelty checks or, going to the local Rotary dinner or something of that nature. And to an extent, it's being the big man of the village. You get the accolades and adulation of being the local member of Parliament out in the electorate, wherein here, you're just another backbencher. So there is more than a little bit of ego at stake here. But being out in the electorate and handing over giant novelty checks is not their job. The actual job of a politician, a member of Parliament, whether it be a 4-year term or an 8-year term, is to vote for or against legislation. And no individual MP has a stronger vote than any other MP. They can all have their say and they can all exercise their power. And that, in the Legislative Council at least, results in a babel of voices, competing interests, varied policy demands, objections and amendments, deals and compromises, policy folded, torn, bundled, spindled and mutilated. Okay, it sounds terrible. It's messy and everyone wants to have their fingers in the policy pie. Someone once said that a camel is a horse designed by a committee. But can the same be said for intrusions by parliamentarians on policy? I used to run regular information sessions with public servants, and their continual gripe to me was, well, why don't MPs just listen to the sound policy advice put to them by ministers in their departments? Well, the simple fact is this. We elect 135 people to Parliament. We pay 135 people to be parliamentarians. I mean, if we just want to do what the Premier wants, then let's get rid of 134 of them. Seriously, if you don't think that parliamentarians showing up with their own self-interest or their electorate's interests does anything useful, well then just ditch Parliament entirely. Have an electoral college which names the Premier and leave it at that. But as long as we have a parliamentary system, then the skill in getting the numbers in both houses of Parliament for the passage, amendment and repeal of laws is actually the job of parliamentarians. But despite the facts on the ground, public servants, political science theorists and executive government all maintain a common assumption of policy creation within a strict two-party system. Strict party discipline and government majorities in both chambers. But that's just not the reality today. What we have is a permanent structural minority in upper houses at both state and federal level because of voting systems and voter preferences. In New South Wales, no party has held a majority since 1988, and in the Senate, federally, no party has held a majority since July 1981, except for a brief period of Howard interregnum that produced from 2005 to 2008, which produced work choices which proved to be politically disastrous. So upper house minority is not some weird new fashion, it's the primary parliamentary structure of the past 40 years. And yet it's still treated by policymakers as some sort of transitory aberration. And now lower house majority is treated as a new and surprising norm, although we often forget that this was the case in most colonial and early Australian parliaments. And there are recent examples of this. Gillard in 2010, Berejiklian in 2021 and Minns in 2023 today. All are double minority governments. Minority control lower house, minority control upper house. And the current polling for federal Labor may see a return to lower house minority government there too. Compounding this problem is that Parliament is generally resentful of the executive, whom they see as aloof, uncaring, unaccountable and arrogant. The ministry is resentful of and distrustful of the Parliament. They're caught between the necessity of Parliament for the passage of money bills and laws versus the hostile interactions and aggravations they face on a daily basis. Question time, budget estimates, upper house inquiries, requests for documents, where non-government majorities can make life difficult, administratively difficult and politically difficult for ministers. Part of the problem of the failure is the failure to recognise the power dynamics of particularly the upper house. What do you think of this statement? Once a decision is made, the policy cycle moves to implementation. The machine of government smoothly implements the wish of cabinet. Now that's the official view of the Australian Policy Handbook written by Althouse and others. And it's as close to a Bible of public policy as you'll find on government. Glenn Davis, one of the authors, is now the head of Prime Minister and Cabinet. The traditional view of policy creation is based on a two-party model with ultra-strict party discipline. Althouse et al. Discussion on the decision process in relation to Australian policy cycle, where they mention the crossbench, and they only mention it in terms of obstructionism of government policy twice. They acknowledge Parliament exists, but the term decision is almost exclusively refers to a cabinet decision. And Althouse's view is reflected in most media commentary and most of what passes for political science in Australia. Cabinet agrees to X, X passes through the rubber stamp of Parliament, and then APS implements X. Crossbenchers have been, at least up until recently, ignored as ineffectual or seen as irritants to the process of good policy making or as unserious players in the bigger parliamentary system. But remember, this is only the Australian model. It's not the model of New Zealand or Canada or Westminster itself. We are not normal. We are an international aberration. In all these other jurisdictions, the role of ordinary MPs is and is recognised as being much more powerful. So do crossbenchers matter? More controversially, should they matter? Does anyone recognise this person? Did he matter for policy creation and policy decisions? He made one of the most important speeches in the past 50 years in the Australian Parliament, yet nowhere can it be found online. What he said and did fundamentally and radically changed the Howard government's GST proposal. Have a listen.
The government's genuine attempt to compensate and to attempt to lock in that compensation is something to be commended, but it cannot be guaranteed. But one thing can be guaranteed, and that is that the goods and services tax, once enshrined in legislation, will never be removed. Decisions we make now on this issue are not for the next 3 years. We are making decisions here that will affect generations. And the question, Madam Acting Deputy President, that I have to ask myself is whether I'm going to be a party to imposing an impersonal, indiscriminate tax on my children, my grandchildren, and their children for generations to come. I cannot. Madam Chair, this has been a bitter decision for me to come to, because I respect the government and I respect the Prime Minister of Australia. One of the most difficult things that I had to do, and I wanted to face him as man to man, but he's on a work of government up in Brisbane, was to speak to him over the phone not so long ago, about an hour ago. And I can only apologise to those in the government who have spent so much time, Minister Kemp, Brian Gibson here, and others, Alan Ferguson, and all of those other people that have done. I just apologise, but I have to live with my own decisions. I know my name will be mud, whichever way it goes, but it's been mud before today, and it'll be mud again later on. So I do apologise for the fact, but I did my best to see whether or not, in the end, I could support the measure.
Okay, that's Brian Harradine, as some of you would remember, an independent from Tasmania. He was the swing vote, which would have got the original GST package over the line. But he said no, and the government had to go to the Australian Democrats instead, with consequent changes to food, education, health and medical products. But importantly, given the usual criticism of the crossbench as illegitimate or unserious, did he sound unserious? Was he frivolous? Was his decision arbitrary or vexatious? I mean, he was a classic negotiating crossbencher. He voted for the partial privatisation of Telstra and extracted massive concessions for his home state of Tasmania. Minority government means that policy is not delivered in a political vacuum, and it's a myth to believe that once a policy is decided by Cabinet, you can just jump to implementation. In New South Wales, the government of the day, when they want to pass a bill through the upper house, will need the support of the official opposition or a section of the crossbench. Labor has 15 MLCs. They need to find 6 more to reach that magic number of 21. Because if you can't count to 21, you don't get your bill. It's as simple as that. Your policy might need to be amended or delayed or revised or compensated or sunsetted or changed in some other way. And when this happens, there's the inevitable cries from government, the public service and the media that this is evidence of some form of dysfunction in politics. Base politics gets in the way of good policy. Illegitimate micro-parties with no mandate, stopping the work of big parties that have a mandate. Spoilers and blockers who won't let legislation through. These people get 7% of the vote and have 100% of the power. But is it true? I'm not saying, and you shouldn't think, that crossbench members are all powerful. Far from it. Government always has options. They can find another crossbench option, as Howard did with the GST. They can go with the official opposition, which strangely enough happens for most bills in Parliament. They can pull the bill entirely and try to do it via regulations, or they can pull the bill entirely and run a public political advocacy campaign. The crossbench are always vulnerable. They don't have full information about the government's other options and negotiating positions. Remember, a government doesn't need to get every member of the crossbench, just 50% plus one of the chamber. Push too hard as a crossbencher and government will look elsewhere. So the crossbench power is conditional upon the circumstance and transitory, short of a formal coalition, which is what the Nationals did with the Liberal Party and up until recently the Greens did in the ACT. And the simple truth is this, and it's massively underexplored despite the acres and acres of newsprint which is devoted to our political process and the role of crossbenchers. The truth is that the crossbench matter in one circumstance only. Whenever the government of the day and the opposition of the day are implacably opposed. And in order to get their numbers, the 21 they need, governments have to persuade people on the crossbench to vote for their bill. That's what our Constitution spelled out. It's not a bug, it's a feature. This is exactly what's expected from a normal Westminster democracy. So one of the major points I want to leave you with today is this. It's the major parties which make the crossbench powerful. Full stop. My old mate John Ruddock, 1 vote out of 42 in the Legislative Council, can achieve nothing. You don't get to be John Ruddock and walk into the chamber one morning, slam the notice paper on the table and declare, I have the balance of power, so I want this, this and this. That's not how it works. But when the government needs that final vote to get the 21 they need to turn an idea into law, then if you're the last person and the Premier rings you up and says, so John, did you read in the newspaper that we're going to do X, Y, Z? I assume you'll be supporting it. Someone like John Ruddock gets to say, oh mate, maybe you should have called me first. I want to go on to another thing, and that's the mandate myth. This necessity to negotiate with minor parties greatly aggravates the major parties. Their view is we shouldn't have to negotiate. You're tiny and we have a mandate from the voters. And some minor parties even buy into this argument. For example, Fred Nile and the CDP worked on the notion that basically we'll back government legislation as long as it doesn't cut across our moral principles. But the idea that minor parties lack a mandate to block purported mandates of the government to do something is hypocritical if you look at voting numbers. Firstly, as I've noted, there's a clear and sustained pattern of tactical voting in Australia where you'll vote for a major party in the lower house and a different party in the upper house. Secondly, even if we ignore this evidence of tactical voting, the simple fact is that few MPs in the lower house win their seats on first preference count alone. They do it after the distribution of preferences. So the majority of voters in their electorate wanted somebody else, but ultimately chose them as the least worst option. In New South Wales in 2023, only 41 major party MLAs achieved a majority on first preference. Federally in 2022, only 15 major party MHRs, 151 of them, 15 major party MHRs achieved a majority on first preference. So it's hardly a resounding endorsement of their own purported mandate. And thus major party criticisms of minors fails on their own logic of electoral legitimacy. So I would encourage lower house MPs to take a reality check. If you think you have a mandate, add up everyone who didn't vote for you as their first preference. So can an executive negotiate with a crossbench successfully? Well, yes, they can. You just have to be willing to deal. Meg Lees and the Democrats agreed to the passage of GST, but with substantial amendments. Shooters did a deal with to support the reforms of the early O'Farrell government in return for hunting in national parks. It was pure horse trading on key issues of importance to both parties. And when O'Farrell couldn't get bipartisan agreement with Labor on electoral funding reform, he went to the Greens in 2012. The 1991 lower house and the 2010 federal independent list of demands were, again, essentially horse trading. And what everyone forgets is that amongst claims of turmoil in both Gillard and the Greiner governments, they both had very substantive policy platforms passed during that period of time of minority government. Yet words like horse trading, log rolling, backroom deals, quid pro quos all have pejorative overtones. But this is a fact of life. You need 50% plus one to get a bill. But some people don't get it. There are plenty of good examples and there are also a few bad examples of how not to negotiate. And as a case study, I'll have a look at the Liberals negotiating with the SFF party in New South Wales. Barry O'Farrell was originally presented with a list of things the SFF wanted, agreed to horse trade on policies, but then later reneged on the deals. But by then, he'd got what he wanted. Gladys, who was presented with a list of things that the SFF wanted, took one look, turned on a heel, said nope, and walked out of the meeting. Dominic was presented with a list of things the SFF wanted, commenced negotiations, but was utterly unserious in actually delivering anything. He was just stringing them along. The point is here, the minor party were the good faith actors and the government were the bad faith actors in each of these dealings. So what do they do? What's the possibility of having minority or minor party or crossbench involvement? Part of the mindset is that nobody in government ever bothers to ask what might crossbenchers bring to the policy table. Will they bring different perspectives, different ideologies, different interest groups, questions which come from a different bounded reality? Is this the real issue here? What's the best solution? Did you consult with all the people who matter? Now, these interventions don't necessarily guarantee better policy outcomes, but you cannot assume that they will not take place. That would be crazy. One final thing I want to talk about is ministerial subterfuge. Ministers understand that the role that can be played by crossbenchers for their own tactical policy purposes. Let's say you're faced with internal opposition to a particular policy proposal. You want to get key parts of your bill through, but it didn't make it through the party room or the cabinet, or the Nationals have revolted and said you can't do it. So let's say you're faced with internal opposition. Cabinet ministers are constrained by cabinet solidarity and party members are constrained by the party room, but you want to put these ideas back into the bill somehow. So it's not unknown for ministers to engage in a bit of subterfuge so they can get their preferred outcomes by other means. Use crossbenchers to achieve your policy goals. And how does it work? Well, it's not uncommon for ministers and or their senior staff to visit the crossbench, usually late at night, in the crossbencher's office where there are fewer prying eyes, and start with something like, just between you and us, here's a bill that you haven't seen yet. We're going to introduce it next week and you're going to hate it. But a clever person like you might come up with amendments which look like this, or this, or this. Now think about it. I'm not kidding, but it's smart business. It's staying... A minister agreeing that you're starting with a negotiated outcome, and the punch and duty show of usual politics will say, oh, no, we're not changing this best of all possible bills in this best of all possible worlds. And Antony says, we're never supporting that horrible bill. But in the end, it's going to be a negotiated outcome through a line of communication which we both foster. More worryingly, there is this modern phenomenon where you have in double minority governments of getting a bill you didn't want. And then the dynamics of a changed parliament, through the growth of the crossbench, it has major implications for final policy outcomes. Any amendment to a greater or lesser degree affects the public servants who must implement the policy. Even more problematic is the question for who's responsible for the implementation of unexpected legislation. And this is not a theoretical exercise. The loss of majority in both houses makes this a very real possibility. The New South Wales government had 18 months of being effectively out of control of the legislative agenda in the parliament. The current New South Wales government doesn't have a majority in either house either. The opposition, the crossbench, could combine to see bills passed. But what happens if you get non-government parties in the lower house, where there is a majority, if you add them all together, pass a bill which then goes to the upper house, which also has a non-government majority, and it gets passed there unamended? What happens is the governor is compelled to sign the bill into law. There's no discretion not to sign. Chris Minns cannot call up the governor and say, do not sign this bill. It's passed through both houses of parliament. You have to sign it, which then leads to the problem, well, now you have a law, but a law which doesn't have the support of government. Who's responsible for making it work? Is it a minister, departmental secretary, the public-facing public service workers? What's the response to unworkable but legislated policy? Is it acceptable now for public servants to go outside the bounds of tradition and criticise parliamentary decisions if they're faced with legislation which is unworkable? And then this is the whole stewardship argument which is going on in the public service across Australia at the moment. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the exciting and dangerous world of active crossbenchers and entrenched minority government.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Antony, for those very insightful presentations. And can I say to you, Phelpsy. I don't think I'll be the only person in this room that from now on, I will always think of you when I get an ice cream at the beach. So thank you for that. So we now have an opportunity to take some questions from the audience. I think we've got about 15 minutes. And there will also be a chance for anyone watching online if you'd like to submit any questions through the live stream. So if you have a question, raise your hand. There's 2 roving mics. We will do our best to get to as many as we can in the time that we have. And I'm sure there's a lot of questions, so any volunteers, start down the front here.
Thanks. Mine's for Peter. There was once a simple answer to the question you posed at the end. The government should resign. And so I'm wondering, and I don't fully understand all this stuff, the institution of fixed terms and set days for elections and so on, is that actually consistent with the shift towards minority government that you have described in your presentation?
Not New South Wales, because you could face a potential situation where hostile non-government parties in both houses pass legislation but refuse to pass a no confidence motion or refuse to block supply, and that's their trigger, which gets out of the 4-year fixed terms. So you could have them as like robotised government.
We can't design for it because, really, there shouldn't. In that situation, a premier should be able to go out to Government House and resign and potentially call an election or ask for another government to be commissioned.
I think we have actually seen sort of this position in the last years of the Napthine government in Victoria. The one member who held the balance of power across, left the Liberal Party, day after day voted with the opposition to allow the opposition to take control of the notice paper, which would normally be grounds for requesting an early election, but there were no grounds. You had to move the vote of no confidence, and the opposition wouldn't move one, and so the whole thing went to stasis for numbers. I mean, the one out on what Peter's talking about is if it was a policy which involved the funding, is that's got to be moved by the lower house, and there's a whole bunch of difficulties there about whether you could pass a bill that involves appropriations of monies. So I think there's a few constitutional issues there.
Well,
but
you
I mean,
couldn't introduce a bill which had an appropriation as part of it, because that's reserved for the executive, and you can't bring it in the upper house because of the general rule of you can't have money bills introduced in the upper house. But there's nothing to stop a policy, a law being enacted, which then government is faced with the situation of having to redirect the resources to its enforcement or to ignore its enforcement, neither of which are in any way, shape or form.
we have seen a couple of, I think,
responsible.
native wildlife and national parks type issues where this has happened and government's just adjusted its expenditure without any difficulty, but
I feel like you two could chat for a while, so I'm just going to interrupt you when you start. Just up the back here. Yep.
All right, Evan. Thank you so much once again. I came here for the tablecloth and stayed here for this brilliant session. So thank you very much for that. I was just sort of thinking, throughout the conversation that I was having just then. A few weeks ago, I was at Central Station and randomly the Daily Telegraph asked to interview me on the spot. And they gone on about, and they went on about, is government or crossbench, more effective and stuff like that. I was not in a position to say anything about that at the time, but I was just sort of thinking, now, with the crossbench becoming more, prevalent in both state and federal politics. Could we, sort of with the future of the crossbench, could we start seeing in the future a little bit like in, Europe and a lot of other governments, you get sort of like those larger, coalition governments or crossbench becoming more stronger, or could it divert, somewhere else in a different path?
we could. I think one of the problems in Australia is that this hasn't coalesced into a rearrangement of the party system. The Coalition and Labor are still the two big beasts, and on the edges you've got alternatives. And in the lower house we're seeing independents elected. one thing that was striking me about, I was listening to Peter talk about the upper house. One interesting thing is to look at the current Senate. I mean, to some extent, oppositions have made life difficult for governments by giving more and more power to the crossbench to have endless debates. The Senate's a good example. You turn on the Senate to hear some serious business going on, and they're debating some motion. Governments really don't have a lot of time to get bills through the Senate these days because of the way they're structured. Though, as we saw on the last day of Parliament, sometimes the opposition says, all right, we're going to get all these through at once. And because the political pressure has been put on the government by but what we have seen with negotiation in this most recent term of the Senate is the Greens, for instance, demanding that certain actions be taken which have got nothing to do with the bill. So, for instance, funding for certain types of housing, the Greens won't agree with it unless you change capital gains tax, which is a completely different issue. You can't just tag it onto that bill. So what they're demanding is a complete change to government policy, a reversal of the stand they had at the last election as a negotiating position. And it's very interesting as this year has gone by, a lot of those things have dropped off as the Greens realise they just weren't getting anywhere with it. There is a degree to which government, the crossbench can debate issues, but it's not tail wagging the dog and demanding that the policies be implemented in this way. Peter's probably got a view on that, I suspect.
No, I think that's legit.
He agrees. There you go. Go down the front.
Yes.
You mentioned the possible revolt of the public service
Yes.
in your talk. That's not really likely since Grenn politicised the public service by removing policy units from the public service, took away their policy development role in respect of social policies, and placed the personnel in the office of the minister, where those positions are now largely filled by politically motivated candidates who want to go and join the political system. So what I'm saying is that as a former public servant and a former member of the Education Policy Unit, we used to make policy based on free and fearless advice from within the public service and the experience of people working at the coalface in service delivery, according to Mintzberg's theory. But now we do an annual code of conduct training to teach us that we must not disagree with the minister of the day under threat of being sacked from the public service. I wanted to ask you about the politicisation of that role.
My comment about the potential revolt of public servants is that normally public servants, it's a traditional standard which we use at estimates, and that is you have your arguments with the public servants about process and you have the arguments with the minister about policy. My argument here is if you faced a situation where the public service is forced to implement a proposal which comes through double minority government, both houses, and they have to implement it, is it then available for them to in fact back the government and say, this is an unenforceable policy, this is a ridiculous policy. Now that goes against the traditional public service mantra of being apolitical, of not discussing policy about Parliament, but it's something which, and there's a big issue of what does stewardship in the public service mean? Does it mean just sitting by while you're forced to implement something which you don't believe you should be doing? And again, I don't know the answer because it would be a big move by any level of public servant, even a departmental secretary, to say, this legislation is crap, we can't implement it, it's got through Parliament, and say that to a budget estimates hearing. That would be pretty out there, but it might be necessary in the situation where they are forced to implement something for which they have neither the desire nor the resources to actually implement.
Yep, go ahead. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. 5 more minutes, there we go.
Great. Sorry, Peter Phelps, you referred to the two-party system a couple of times and gave a list of reasons why more people were voting for other parties. I suspect one of the reasons is some people actually, referring to crossbenchers, that's one way of doing it, but it's actually a desire to have a multi-party system, which is, in Europe there's lots of examples of that where they have to form coalitions and it's a multi-party system. We obviously historically come out of a two-party system, but there's no reason, and I think the New South Wales electoral system does not stop the development of a multi-party system. My question for both of you is, I have never cast a valid vote in a federal lower house election because I refused to be forced to vote for the two parties, the two major parties, and basically by requiring you to tick all the boxes in a preferential vote for the lower house, they are seeking to enforce the two-party system. Do you agree that that is a bad political system?
Antony, you want to kick off with that one?
You are asking whether, what your question is basically saying the only proper system is proportional representation.
No, optional preferential systems.
But in the end, there's a lot of confusion about people throw around about two-party system. America is a two-party system. In America, their electoral system has two parties structured into it. In this country, it's not. We've had a system where over time, the two parties have dominated and taken most votes, and over time it's decreasing. Now, people say to me, with preferential voting, all votes end up with the major parties. Of course, we've got more members in the crossbench now than ever had. In the end, you don't have to vote for the two major parties. I would agree with you on optional preferential voting. I'd be surprised, but at various times, both sides of politics have supported optional preferential voting. And usually when the other side supports it, the other side opposes that change in the policy because it fits in. Look, I mean, optional preferential voting, I actually tend to agree with it, partly because, what's it, Colin Hughes' phrase? Yeah. It's like herding cats. Why do we have to herd people to express a preference for everyone? They've turned up, they voted for the candidates they want to vote for. Why do they have to express a preference for everyone else? That's my view on that. And if it cuts this proportion of exhausted votes, so the better. But the one thing I would always point out, that people who support optional preferential voting for that reason, it always helps the biggest party as well.
That's it. Yeah.
Peter,
because it effectively becomes de facto first past the post.
Well, it doesn't. No,
the
Campbell-Newman government, 9 seats changed on preferences, and that was optional preferential voting. They've suddenly changed to supporting it.
Campbell-Newman is not really an example.
It's possibly the case.
Okay, I think we'll have time for one more. Yep.
So just looking forward, so we've seen growth of the crossbench. I'm interested from the perspective of the further growth of that in the short to medium term. Are the barriers to entry currently appropriate, and are the mechanisms to support these smaller parties sufficient at the moment? Given that obviously from the major parties, their perspective, it's a little bit of a love and a hate thing.
I don't think there's any love at all for minor parties from the major parties.
I think the issue is actually the decline of support for the major parties.
Yeah.
I mean, compulsory voting has probably buttressed the major parties over time, but over time it's declining. There are people who no longer support either of the major parties, have other issues. I mean, the old theory about political party structures is that you have cleavages in society, and we, like most Anglo-Saxon countries, tend to have a cleavage which is Labour versus capital. I mean, nowadays that's more of an inherited memory of people voting 1 or 2 generations in the past, but that tends to be the cleavage. If you've got a lot of European countries, you not only have a Labour versus capital cleavage, you have a church versus state cleavage. You have Protestant versus Catholic, city versus country. If you read Don Aiken's early work in about 1970, he said 3 cleavages in Australian society: class, city versus country, and Catholic versus Protestant. Now, the third one's disappeared. I think class has diminished. City versus country, I think, is actually getting bigger than it used to be. But those cleavages change over time. But certainly, we don't have the sort of multi-cleavages that you see in European nations. The interesting thing for us is we are continuing with, and in Britain, we're continuing with a single-member electoral system, which tends to push into a two-party system. But our two-party system is declining. New Zealand, which went to PR with proportional representation, is going back to a dominant two-party system. Now, over there, you're very hard to get a majority. Here, you still tend to get a majority, but I think there's a strong possibility. The last 4 of the last 5 federal elections now, the winning party's got 77 or fewer seats. So, I mean, I don't expect we're going to see many more landslides in the future. We're going to see a lot of these hung parliaments because the major party vote is declined. And it's not the national vote that matters. The lower the major party vote, the more seats that don't end up as two-party contests. 27 of the 151 last time were not two-party contests. When I did my first election, there was one in 1990. So that number is increasing, and that's forcing change on the House of Representatives.
Just getting back to your question about will more arise. More will arise if they can carve out a niche on the political beach. There's enough in terms of administrative funding for parties, for election day funding on per vote basis, for parties to be largely self-sustaining as long as they're not particularly extravagant. The question is, can you find, can you plant your umbrella on the beach somewhere and get enough people to buy your ice cream? If you can, that is a statistically advantageous position for you to be in. You will never be a major party, but you will lock in that vote because you offer them something which the major parties, as I said, don't and cannot offer them.
And the other thing I would add about that, about small parties, the problem with small parties is when they get bigger and suddenly they actually have to have a broader agenda. And I think you tend to see that with the Greens, that they tend to be very...
well, Pauline Hanson's One Nation is a classic example.
They have had other problems.
Grow, crash.
I think we won...
Leave the party, come in.
The Greens have a set of... I remember someone saying to me, oh, but I vote the Greens because they have this policy that I really agree with. The Greens have factions, they're just not as obvious to everyone outside as the political parties. And those factions are reflections of the divisions on policy and also personality within parties.
Thank you. We'll have to wrap it up there. I'm getting the nod from Janelle, so you have to listen to Janelle. She's the usher of the Black Rod when you're a Member of Parliament. Thank you. Thank you to you both. That was really insightful and fascinating, and I'm sure everyone will agree that we've learned a lot from having you two gentlemen join us this afternoon. So just join me in thanking Dr. Phelps and Mr. Grenn.